forward a few years, and I was asked to come to National Geographic to work on an atlas. So there I am with my spiffy Windows 2000 computer. It was high-tech at the time. GIS couldn't be done on a Mac, so I was using a PC and making those big, beautiful pull-out maps in the magazine. I left National Geographic for a short time. I thought I might become an academic. So I went to grad school. I did a lot of field work in Bolivia. That was my house there with all of the poultry that came with it. But what I really found was, while I liked academia, I liked research, I liked publishing, really storytelling was it for me. And so I left grad school, went back to National Geographic, and I worked at the magazine for a long time. So for 10 years, I was a creative editor, I was an executive editor, I was an art director, and I was the director of commercial maps. And that was amazing. The platform of those publications, what I was able to do, were incredible. But then my journey took another twist about 8 years ago when I moved over to the nonprofit side of National Geographic. And I've been, for the last 8 years, figuring out how do we really do storytelling and impact storytelling in a nonprofit way. So I want to tell you a little bit about impact with storytelling, what I've learned, what science has shown us in the last few years. So why do stories matter? I think I'm hard-pressed to find people who say stories and storytelling doesn't matter, but people can't really put their finger on why. I love this quote from Joseph Campbell, and I think it is so true. Numbers, facts are forgettable, but we remember stories. And in fact, we often remember the facts that are embedded in stories. Some anthropologists actually argue that storytelling is what makes us human. Now, some whale researchers may say that whales are also telling stories, to still be yet proved or determined, but I think we can all agree that humans are unique in our ability to tell stories. Almost every culture has storytelling. It's how we remember our history. It's how we put our kids to bed. It's why jokes are funny. It's how we remember the past. Stories matter. Stories engage the brain. They engage a different part of our brain and a different part of our nervous system than facts and numbers do. They stay with us longer. They activate parts of our brain that are associated with deep memory and feelings. And so they just stick in a different way. They create emotional connections. You meet people through stories. You find universality in them. And so because of that, there are deep emotional connections, and that's why stories are so memorable. They also can simplify really complex ideas. This is part of what I did for years and years at National Geographic magazine, was take the most hairy, complex science or social science problems and simplify them into a storyline. And you can do that by expert editing. You can do it through analogy or metaphor, but they really help us tackle those big, hairy things. So I'm not going to have time today to walk through all of this. At another date, I hope I can, but the elements of a good story really matter. Character, emotion, conflict, and resolution. I'm going to touch on some of these as we go forward. Strong characters. I think everyone knows who this is. This story, Lord of the Ring, resonates because of its really strong character. And I would argue that one of the reasons that this is such a strong character is because he is relatable. He's not a superhero. We all can identify with him. He had a normal life in the Shire and got thrown into a big challenge. But at the end, he just wants to go home. So I would say, if you want to make impact with your storytelling, find a really relatable, strong character. Someone who, yes, is aspirational and yes, can do amazing things, but your audience can still connect with. Place matters. Place really matters in your story. And I find a lot of, particularly scientists, gloss over the power of place. You want to ground your audience in, where are you? What's this place like? What's it smell like? What's it feel like? Because we all know that place matters to us. Emotions. As I said before, story really evokes emotions. There's a lot of research, cognitive research, coming out of the University of Florida that shows that these are the emotions on the top that you should evoke when possible, that are the emotions that people like. You want to sit with them. You want to stick with them. And then the second set of emotions we should really use sparingly. These are emotions that, yes, they're a key part of the human experience. They're a key part of stories, but people run away from them. So while you can sprinkle them in through stories, or while you can make a quick hit with them, people aren't going to come back for more. So awe, pride, parental love, hope. Try to evoke that as much as possible in your storytelling. And the research around parental love is really interesting. People don't have to be parents to really resonate with that emotion too. I'm so sorry, I'm going to skip that one. Many of you may have learned this in school. In American schools, we learned it. This is very old. This is Greek structure of storytelling. And really, we know this intrinsically. Stories need a beginning, a middle, and end. You need to develop a story. There needs to be some sort of tension and climax, and then it needs to resolve. In kids' stories, in English, we say, and they lived happily ever after. That's the resolution. Our brains from such a very young age are wired to follow this structure and to want stories to fall into this. Now, I will say that in many traditional Chinese, Japanese, and Korean narratives, this may be familiar for many in the audience, the story arc looks more like this. But I think what is universal is that there is a beginning, a middle, an end, some sort of tension or twist, and then there's resolution. I think as you're telling stories, and be they, a business pitch or a scientific theory you want to put forward, try to always fall into these three areas. I see a lot of scientists get stuck in the introduction part. They want to tell me everything about everything, set the groundwork, and they never get to the tension, and then they never resolve. And you can see even in my very short introduction of myself, I introduced where I was from. I introduced a little bit of tension of I didn't know what I wanted to be, went to grad school, I ended up coming back to National Geographic, and then it resolves. It resolves into I found nonprofit storytelling, and here I am today. So even in the simplest stories, try to think about this structure. Now, it's, of course, more complicated. Kurt Vonnegut, who's a very famous American novelist, had this theory years ago when he was a PhD student at the University of Chicago that most stories can fall into several story arcs. Now, University of Chicago at the time said this was not acceptable for an anthropology thesis, but fast forward, and some researchers just a few years ago, now using AI and algorithms, were able to take his theory and apply it to these 6 fundamental story shapes. And so they analyzed many works of fiction and found that actually it's true. Most stories fall into these 6 arcs of narrative. Now, I'm not saying that you have to become an expert in this or that you need to go deep into it, but I think it's really important to know that our human brains have been culturally conditioned, particularly this is a Western study, but we could do it for other cultures as well, to look for stories, to place stories into arcs that make sense, that are familiar. We want to take things that are unknown and place it into a familiar construct. So I'm just going to really quickly go through some things that I would do much more in depth with you of when you are trying to tell stories, what do you want to do? First of all, I would say try to have a goal. What are you trying to achieve with your story? Everyone who's ever worked with me knows that I like to say over and over, what is the purpose and who's the audience of your story? So here's 2 examples of goals. You want to make it very specific for your audience. Eat less meat resonates much more closely with people than save the planet. So as specific as you can make with your goal the better. Audience. Who needs to take action to achieve your goal? If you are trying to tell this story to someone, is it the CEO of the company who has the power to take the action? Is it a groundswell movement? Think about that as you're constructing your narrative. You also want to appeal to values. Now, this is a U.S. study, again, out of the University of Florida, but I think it's pretty, I've tried this around the world and it's pretty universal. Now, I'll say this is very broad brush. Most people resonate with most of these values, but in general, if you're talking with conservative audiences, these are the things that resonate with them. They care about standards of morality and decency. They care about the in-group loyalty and a very much reverence and respect for authority and hierarchy. Liberal, oftentimes in the U.S., we think of this as younger generations. You can appeal much more through fairness, equality, justice, and protecting people from harm, particularly those who are more vulnerable and have less power. Again, these values are universal, they can apply, but in general, as you're thinking about your audience, this is a paradigm to think about. Character, I mentioned this before. Who do you want to choose to be the main character of your story? In my story, I chose myself because I am trying to connect with you. I can't be there in person with you, but I want you to feel like you know me a little bit. But as you're constructing a story, be it fiction or nonfiction, what story aligns with your goal? Who's the most affected? And who is your audience really going to resonate and relate to? Finally, I call this my irony slide because I've written it all down, but our brain processes visuals 60,000 times faster than text. We are primates, we have big eye sockets, we evolved to scan the horizon looking for prey and predators, and so we are visual creatures. And so if we had more time, I'd go into how to create effective visuals for your stories, but just know this science. And rather than fight against it and fill your slides with many, many words and try to have people read things, perhaps lean into this, lean into the visuals. It will help you. And finally, the last thing I want to leave you with today, because I know people get hung up on this, and some of the best storytellers in the world, I put them on a stage and they freeze. I will just say public speaking is just storytelling. And if you take one thing away from this that I hope you really learn and sits with you is that public speaking is just storytelling. Speak confidently and tell a story, and your audience will love you. And so now it's my great pleasure to hand over to the incredible National Geographic explorers that are with you today. Thank you for listening to me. I wish I could be there in person, and I'll hand over to Anand. Thank you.
I think the
Let's explore, let's learn more about impact storytelling. Over the last 2 days, I've had the extreme privilege to get to spend some more time with Anand and get to know him a little bit more through our conversations over dinner or the tech checks on this massive stage to prepare for this session for you all today. And not only is Anand an incredible and talented National Geographic photographer, or an incredibly insightful storyteller, but he is someone who puts a lot of intention into everything that he shares. So the perfect teacher for us to learn from today on impact storytelling. So let's please welcome on stage Anand Varma. Welcome, Anand.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Melati.
Yeah, I know that you're all it's very dark. We don't get to see you as much, but we know you're there. And I wanted to kick off, Anand, with telling us a little bit, did you always know you wanted to be a storyteller?
You know, that's an interesting question, because this has been a very unexpected journey for me. In fact, I really started out as a kid who loved science, who loved the outdoors, and assumed that the only path for me was to become a scientist. That was the only way to live a life exploring the outdoors and learning about the natural world.
Interesting. And so when did photography then kind of kick in?
Photography for me was a little bit of an accidental discovery. So it wasn't until the end of high school that I picked up my dad's camera and I would bring it along with me on my adventures through the forest around my home. And there was one moment that I remember where my relationship to photography changed. And it was this moment where I was exploring the woods with my best friend, and we found a snake in the forest. And I had this little camera, and I decided to sneak up on this snake and take a picture of it. And I took this image, and it's not a particularly impressive image. You know, the image itself doesn't resonate with me. It doesn't stick with me. It's the memory of my friend's reaction to this image. I took this picture and he lost his mind with all the detail that we could see. I mean, the real snake, the thing was right there. We could have been looking at the real thing, but instead we were celebrating this image. And what stuck with me from that moment so many years ago is this realization that photography has the power to inspire wonder and excitement and joy and passion for the natural world. And it's that feeling that has stuck with me all these years.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Also, hearing what you, how you thought you weren't going to be a storyteller, you had all these different visions for how you wanted to grow up and the role you wanted to play, but somehow you've managed to combine and connect the passion for this natural world and communicate it through storytelling, visual storytelling. As Kaitlin said as well, we're very visual creatures, right? And then once you took this photo, how did you move forward in your photography journey?
Sure. I mean, I went to university still thinking I was going to be a scientist. That was my goal since I was 8 years old.
Yeah.
And then one summer, while I was still a student, I got this job working for a photographer. And my job was to rappel into caves to look for these bugs so that the photographer who was working for National Geographic at the time, he wanted to document these new species. And I realized in working for him, I mean, you can see how much fun I'm having in this scene, learning how to rappel into caves. I thought, wow, actually, what I wanted to do as a scientist, to explore the world, to learn about nature, to learn about science, I could do through photography. But at the same time, I was terrified of trying to pursue this uncharted path. There's no guidebook of how to become a photographer.
Right.
I was working for this guy who had started his career with National Geographic. I could see a reference point, but I had no idea how to get there. Science was kind of more straightforward. Not that it's easy to become a scientist, but there are people you can follow, there are paths you can follow. You can go to graduate school. Photography seemed like this very scary unknown.
Right. Almost this abstract concept to you, especially when you had that scientific pathway in mind. But, how did you then take these opportunities and these experiences working for a National Geographic photographer to then becoming a National Geographic photographer? How did you make that transition?
Yeah, so even though I was afraid of this unknown path, I couldn't let go of this opportunity either. It was the adventure of a lifetime. I got to travel all over the world carrying his bags and learning new things, and so I knew I had to give it my best shot. And the first step of that was getting a National Geographic Explorer grant, and that gave me the opportunity to try my own ideas, and that introduced me to editors, and that's where I pitched my first story, which became a story for National Geographic on mind-controlling parasites, which I happened to pitch this idea at just the right time when a writer had proposed this story. They didn't think that this could be photographed, and I had a friend from the university who studied these parasites, and so she gave me this special access. And so I came in as a young photographer with very little experience, but with an idea that resonated with these editors, and they wanted to figure out how to translate this really fascinating story into images. And so I came in with the right experience working for photographers. I had an Explorer grant from National Geographic, which let me meet these editors, and then I had the right idea at the right time. And so what you're looking at here, this is a ladybug that's standing over the cocoon of a parasitic wasp, which has just emerged from its body, and that parasite has figured out how to control the mind of that ladybug and turn it into a zombie bodyguard. And so this ladybug is protecting the wasp from predators. And I'll go through a few examples of the other images that I've taken for National Geographic magazine. So another example of these mind-controlling parasites, this is a crab that's been infected by a parasitic barnacle. And this barnacle has the incredible power of transforming the body of the crab. So when it's infected, if the crab is male, the parasite turns it into a female. It forces it to grow an egg chamber. It lays its own eggs inside and then makes that feminized crab think it's pregnant so that it will care for the eggs of the parasite. And so all these tiny specks you see in the scene are actually tiny parasitic barnacle larvae that are emerging from this infected crab.
Wow.
And then this led to the next story on honeybees. And so I wanted to show, how are scientists studying honeybees? Especially in North America, honeybees are facing a lot of challenges. And so I wanted to show how are scientists trying to understand these challenges and tackle these challenges. So this is a photograph of an experiment to test the effect of pesticides on honeybees. They sedate them with carbon dioxide and they dose them with this chemical. And this is another experiment to understand how pesticides affect the memory of honeybees. And so they actually control the bees, they stick them in these little plastic chambers and expose them to floral scents, like a cinnamon-scented air, and then give them this little cotton swab dipped in sugar. And so that through that process, they can decode whether the bee remembers the smell, and they can essentially look at how that bee is learning and whether that learning is being affected by pesticides that are spread on crops.
Wow, these photographs are stunning, and I love the detail and the attention, but also the story. It's a different story. I don't know about all of you, but when I look at this bee photo, for example, I'm almost curious how I will see bees the next time I see bees, right? It's fascinating how you're taking almost these everyday passing tiny objects, insects everywhere, and bringing a new way to look at it. And through these still photographs. But I know you've also evolved a lot in your way of visual storytelling. So when did you, or when did you realize that there was more to explore than still photographs?
Just to address one of the points you came up with, like in terms of showing the world in a new way, I think that's the through line through all my photography. Like, how can I take a camera and use it to extend our ability to perceive the world around us. So with these images of tiny little insects, it's a lot about magnifying details, but there's a couple of other examples where, for example, this story on bats, these are not tiny creatures, but they move in ways that we can't perceive. They're moving too fast in the middle of the night, and so I wanted to think about, can I use the power of photography to capture motion, for example. This is a long exposure of a bat flying through a flight cage, and that long exposure allows me to capture the shape of its wings as it flies through the cage. And this is an example of an experiment that shows how scientists study the echolocation of bats. This is a giant carnivorous bat, about a 1 meter wingspan, and it's a species that hunts rodents and birds and other bats. And so you can see it's honing in on this mouse on a cage. So this idea of magnifying details and capturing time and motion was a central part of this story on hummingbirds. And so this is showing how scientists use special devices like fog machines to trace the airflow around a hummingbird's wings, or using high-speed cameras to capture how they dry themselves off in the rain. And so, these are images that show us things our eyes can't see, but the goal is to try to inspire people to look at the world around them in a new way. They're not so invisible that we would never be able to perceive this, but it hints at these kind of wonderful secrets that the world has to share with us. And this point you brought up about still photography, I mean, along the way, as I'm taking these images for a printed magazine, I'm also finding these opportunities and these stories that don't fit on a printed page. And so especially, for example, the story on honeybees, I kept a hive of honeybees in my home, in my garage, and I would go back there and I would watch the bees inside the hive, and I would see these different life stages. A baby bee looks like a totally alien creature. It looks kind of gross as this, almost like a little maggot. Kind of gooey, white, grubby looking thing. And yet the bee itself is this beautiful, furry creature that flies around. And I wanted to know, how does this transformation happen? And I can't really show this with a still image, but maybe through a video, I can tell the story of this transformation. And so I figured out, with the help of scientists, how to raise bees in front of a time-lapse camera. And so what I'll show next is this video that shows the first 21 days of a bee's life condensed into 60 seconds. What you see here is that egg of a honeybee just swirling around, swimming around inside the beehive. It's being fed this milky substance from the adult bees that allow it to feed and grow until this moment of transformation. This is when that larva becomes a pupa. That's the part where its head and its legs start to separate. And you can see that same process from above. You can actually see the parasites also running around inside the hive. And then this moment where the cells inside the bee, especially inside its head, start to reorganize. The color emerges in its eyes. And the last step of the process is its skin shrivels up and it sprouts hair.
And it's the first 21 days, right?
It's 3 weeks process condensed into 1 minute.